The morning sun cast long shadows across the perfectly manicured lawns of Palace, as Queen Elizabeth II prepared for what would become one of the most unexpectedly entertaining state dinners in British royal history. The year was 1991, and the palace staff had spent weeks preparing for the arrival of President George H.W. Bush and First Lady Barbara Bush. Everything had been planned down to the smallest detail, from the precise placement of the ceremonial guards to the exact temperature of the soup course. What nobody had planned for was the Queen's corgi, Whisper, who had developed an unusual fascination with the American president's distinctive white hair. The small dog had been rescued from a shelter just months earlier, and while the Queen had successfully trained dozens of corgis throughout her reign, Whisper seemed determined to write his own rules of royal protocol. The trouble began during the formal welcome ceremony on the palace lawn. President Bush stood at attention beside the Queen as the military band played both national anthems. The crowd of dignitaries, press photographers, and palace staff maintained the solemn dignity expected of such occasions. Even the other royal corgis sat obediently beside their handlers, their behavior a testament to decades of royal training. Whisper, however, had other plans. The moment the band finished playing the Star-Spangled Banner, the small corgi broke free from his golden leash and made a beeline directly toward the president. Secret Service agents tensed, unsure whether this constituted a security threat or simply an overly enthusiastic royal pet. The Queen's expression remained perfectly composed, but those who knew her well could detect the slight tightening around her eyes that indicated she was fighting back laughter. President Bush, a man known for his diplomatic grace under pressure, stood frozen as Whisper launched himself directly at his legs. The corgi began an elaborate dance around the president's ankles, barking with what could only be described as pure joy. The more the president tried to gently discourage the attention, the more excited Whisper became. Soon, the small dog was literally bouncing up and down, trying desperately to reach the president's distinctive silver hair. "I believe Whisper finds you quite fascinating, Mr. President," the Queen said with the barest hint of amusement in her voice. The comment broke the tension, and soon both leaders were laughing as Whisper continued his enthusiastic welcome dance. The press photographers, initially unsure whether they should capture such an undignified moment, began snapping pictures furiously once they saw both leaders smiling. The situation escalated when Whisper managed to jump high enough to actually touch the president's hair with his paw. Bush, rather than being annoyed, began laughing so hard that tears formed in his eyes. "Well, Your Majesty," he said between chuckles, "I think this is the most thorough security screening I've ever received." Barbara Bush, watching from a few feet away, was openly laughing. "George," she called out, "I think you've made a new best friend." The First Lady's obvious delight with the situation helped everyone else relax, and soon the entire gathering was chuckling as Whisper continued his acrobatic attempts to investigate the president's hair more thoroughly. The Queen's equerry, a man who had served the royal family for 20 years and prided himself on handling any crisis with dignity, found himself in the unprecedented position of chasing a corgi around the President of the United States while maintaining proper ceremonial bearing. Each time he approached Whisper, the clever dog would dart between Bush's legs, using the president as an unwitting shield in their impromptu game of chase. "Perhaps we should move inside," suggested Prince Philip, who had been watching the scene with barely concealed glee. The Duke of Edinburgh had always appreciated moments when royal protocol encountered the unpredictable realities of life, and Whisper's performance was exceeding even his expectations for entertainment. The procession toward the palace doors became an unusual parade. The Queen and President Bush walked side by side, maintaining their diplomatic conversation about trade relations and international cooperation, while Whisper trotted alongside them, occasionally jumping up to pat Bush's leg with his paws. The Secret Service agents adapted admirably, maintaining their protective positions while carefully stepping around an increasingly confident corgi, who seemed to believe he was now part of the official security detail. Inside the palace, the staff had prepared the state dining room with meticulous attention to detail. The table gleamed with the finest royal china, crystal glasses caught and reflected the light from the magnificent chandeliers, and fresh flowers from the palace gardens created elegant centerpieces. The room represented centuries of British diplomatic tradition, a setting where world leaders had negotiated treaties, resolved conflicts, and strengthened international relationships. Whisper surveyed this grand setting and apparently decided it needed his immediate attention. While the guests assembled for pre-dinner cocktails in the blue drawing room, the enterprising corgi began his own inspection tour of the dining arrangements. Palace staff watched in growing horror as he investigated each place setting with the thoroughness of a professional food critic. The Queen's longtime butler, a man whose discretion and competence were legendary among royal staff, found himself facing a crisis that had never been covered in any protocol manual. Should he chase the corgi away from the state dinner table, potentially creating more disruption? Should he alert the Queen, interrupting her conversation with the President? Or should he simply hope that Whisper would lose interest and wander away before the dinner began? The decision was made for him when Whisper discovered the elaborate flower arrangements. The corgi had apparently concluded that these decorations were some sort of sophisticated dog toys, placed specifically for his entertainment. He began a systematic investigation of each centerpiece, sniffing delicately at the roses and carnations before moving on to the more exotic blooms that the palace gardeners had specially cultivated for the occasion. Lady Sarah, the Queen's niece, was the first to notice Whisper's floral exploration. Rather than being alarmed, she began quietly pointing out the corgi's activities to other family members, and soon a small group had gathered to watch his performance. Prince whispered something to his sister Anne, who tried unsuccessfully to suppress a laugh. Even the Queen Mother, known for her appreciation of well-behaved pets, seemed charmed by Whisper's obvious enthusiasm for the proceedings. The situation reached its peak when Whisper decided that one particular arrangement of white roses needed his personal touch. Standing on his hind legs, he carefully selected a single perfect bloom and carried it in his mouth toward the head table where the Queen and President Bush would be seated. The sight of a small corgi delicately carrying a white rose like some sort of furry wedding attendant was too much for several guests, who began laughing openly. President Bush, entering the dining room at that exact moment, stopped in amazement. "Well, I'll be," he said, his Texas drawl more pronounced with amusement. "Is that little fellow bringing me a flower?" The president's genuine delight with the gesture set the tone for the entire evening, transforming what could have been an embarrassing breach of protocol into a charming moment that would be remembered fondly for years to come. The Queen, demonstrating the quick thinking that had served her well through decades of public appearances, smoothly incorporated Whisper's contribution into the evening's proceedings. "It appears Whisper has taken upon himself to help with the table arrangements," she said with perfect composure. "He has quite definite opinions about proper presentation." The dinner proceeded with Whisper stationed nearby, having apparently decided that his duties as unofficial host required his continued presence. He lay quietly beside the Queen's chair, occasionally lifting his head to survey the room and ensure that everything was proceeding according to his standards. Every so often, he would fix his gaze on President Bush's hair, as if contemplating another investigation, but seemed content to simply observe from his position of honor. The conversation flowed smoothly between the two leaders, covering everything from economic cooperation to environmental protection. But the real entertainment came from the subtle comedy of watching distinguished diplomats and government officials trying to maintain their dignity while sneaking glances at Whisper, who had positioned himself perfectly to observe all the proceedings. Secretary of State James Baker, a man known for his serious demeanor and diplomatic skill, found himself completely charmed by the corgi's presence. During a brief lull in the conversation, he leaned toward the Queen and said, "Your Majesty, I have to say that Whisper has been the most entertaining diplomatic escort I've ever encountered." The comment sparked a discussion about the role of pets in international relations, with both Bush and the Queen sharing stories of other animals who had unexpectedly influenced diplomatic events. The Queen revealed that her corgis had actually played informal roles in numerous state visits over the years, often serving as conversation starters that helped break the ice with visiting dignitaries. She told the story of a previous American president who had been nervous about meeting the royal family until one of her dogs had fallen asleep on his feet during a reception, creating an instant bond that lasted throughout his visit. President Bush countered with tales of his own dog's adventures in the White House, including an incident where his Springer Spaniel had once chased a visiting ambassador's cat through 3 different state rooms during an important reception. The exchange of pet stories created exactly the kind of warm, personal connection that formal diplomatic protocols often struggle to achieve. As the evening progressed, Whisper's presence became increasingly natural to everyone involved. He seemed to understand that he was part of something important, maintaining his best behavior while clearly enjoying his role as unofficial co-host. When the Queen rose to offer the traditional toast to Anglo-American friendship, Whisper stood as well, his tail wagging slowly in what appeared to be his own gesture of diplomatic approval. The toast itself became memorable not just for the Queen's eloquent words about the special relationship between their two nations, but for the sight of Whisper sitting perfectly upright beside her chair, as if he too understood the significance of the moment. President Bush, raising his glass in response, looked down at the corgi and added, "And to Whisper, who has shown us all that diplomacy works best when it comes from the heart." The evening concluded with what would become known among palace staff as Whisper's farewell performance. As the guests prepared to leave the dining room, the corgi apparently decided that proper etiquette required him to personally see off each important visitor. He made a circuit of the table, stopping beside each guest's chair for what appeared to be individual goodbyes, complete with gentle tail wags and the occasional polite paw shake. President Bush was saved for last, receiving what could only be described as a state farewell from Whisper. The corgi sat formally beside the president's chair, extended one paw in a perfect handshake gesture, and then gave a small bark that everyone interpreted as his official diplomatic goodbye. The president, entering fully into the spirit of the moment, solemnly shook the offered paw and thanked Whisper for his hospitality. As the evening wound down, Queen Elizabeth II reflected on how a simple breach of protocol had transformed into one of the most genuinely warm and memorable state dinners of her reign. The formal photographs would show the usual dignified poses and serious expressions expected of such occasions. But the real story of the evening would be told in the candid shots of world leaders laughing with genuine delight at the antics of one small, determined corgi, who had decided that international diplomacy needed his personal touch. The next morning's newspapers would feature headlines about trade agreements and diplomatic cooperation, but the stories that would be retold in both the White House and Palace for years to come would center on Whisper's unauthorized but highly successful debut on the international stage. The little corgi had managed something that formal protocol sometimes struggled to achieve. He had created a genuine human connection between world leaders that transcended politics and nationality. Years later, when President Bush would visit Britain again, one of his first questions would always be about Whisper's health and well-being. The corgi had earned himself a permanent place in the history of Anglo-American relations, proving that sometimes the best diplomacy comes from the most unexpected sources. The ancient stones of Windsor Castle had witnessed many extraordinary events throughout their 800-year history, but few occasions had tested the composure of the royal family quite like Princess' infamous 70th birthday celebration in the year 2000. What was intended to be an elegant, intimate gathering of close family and friends instead became a comedy of errors that would be whispered about in royal circles for decades to come. The trouble began 3 weeks before the party when Princess announced that she wanted something different for her milestone birthday. Having attended countless formal state occasions, charity galas, and traditional royal celebrations throughout her life, the Queen's younger sister declared that she was absolutely bored to tears with conventional entertaining. She informed the palace staff with characteristic determination, a party that would actually be fun. The Queen Mother, then celebrating her own remarkable longevity at nearly 100 years old, enthusiastically supported her younger daughter's desire for something unconventional. "Has always been the artistic one in the family," she told the Queen during one of their regular afternoon tea sessions. "Perhaps it's time we let her creativity shine." These words would later be remembered with both fondness and slight regret as events unfolded. Princess' vision for her celebration centered around a murder mystery dinner party, complete with costumes, assigned characters, and an elaborate plot that would unfold throughout the evening. She had become fascinated with mystery novels during a recent period of recovery from illness, and the idea of transforming her birthday party into an interactive theatrical experience appealed to her sense of drama and love of performance. The palace event planning staff, accustomed to organizing everything from state banquets to garden parties with military precision, found themselves facing an entirely new challenge. How does one plan a murder mystery party for members of the royal family? What constitutes appropriate protocol when the Queen might be asked to play a suspicious character? How formal should the invitation wording be when requesting that dukes and duchesses come prepared to solve a fictional crime? Lady Sarah Jones, Princess' daughter, threw herself into the planning with enthusiasm that matched her mother's vision. She worked closely with a professional mystery party company to develop a plot that would be engaging enough to entertain sophisticated guests while remaining appropriate for a royal setting. The chosen scenario involved a fictional house party at a country estate in the 1920s, where guests would play various characters ranging from eccentric relatives to mysterious servants. The character assignments were distributed 2 weeks before the party, along with detailed costume suggestions and background information for each role. Prince Charles received the character of Lord Reginald, a pompous aristocrat with a secret gambling problem. Princess Anne was cast as Lady Beatrice, a sharp-tongued spinster with suspiciously detailed knowledge of poisons. Prince became Captain James, a dashing military hero with a mysterious past, while Prince Edward was assigned the role of Timothy, a nervous young heir afraid of his own shadow. The Queen initially resisted participating in the theatrical aspects of the evening, preferring to attend as herself and observe the proceedings. However, Princess' persuasive powers and the Queen Mother's encouragement eventually convinced her to accept the character of Mrs., the dignified but secretly observant housekeeper who sees everything that happens in the great house. Prince Philip, upon learning about his assigned character of Professor, a absent-minded inventor prone to creating explosive contraptions, immediately began researching the role with the thoroughness he typically brought to his official duties. His enthusiasm for the part would prove to be both entertaining and slightly dangerous as the evening progressed. The costume preparation alone provided endless entertainment for the palace staff. Watching Prince Charles practice walking with the pompous swagger required for Lord Reginald, or observing Princess Anne perfect the haughty sniff of Lady Beatrice, gave the household a glimpse of the royal family's hidden theatrical talents. The Queen Mother, despite her advanced age, insisted on participating as Madame, a mysterious fortune-teller, and spent hours perfecting an elaborate Eastern European accent that bore no resemblance to any actual language. The evening began with cocktails in the green drawing room, where guests arrived in character and began interacting according to their assigned personalities. The transformation was remarkable. Suddenly, the familiar faces of the royal family had become an eccentric collection of 1920s house party guests, each hiding secrets and nursing grudges against their fellow attendees. Prince Charles, fully embracing Lord Reginald's character, had adopted an exaggerated upper-class accent that was so ridiculous even his own family struggled not to laugh. He spent the cocktail hour boasting about his fictional horse racing victories and making increasingly outrageous claims about his imaginary wealth. His performance was so convincing that several guests momentarily forgot they were watching the heir to the throne and began responding to him as if he were genuinely an insufferable aristocrat. Princess Anne's portrayal of the acidic Lady Beatrice proved equally entertaining. Known in real life for her quick wit and no-nonsense attitude, she channeled these qualities into creating a character who delivered cutting remarks with surgical precision. Her opening line to Prince Dashing Captain, "I see you've managed to find your way here without getting lost, Captain. How remarkable for someone with your limited mental capacity," set the tone for her devastating performance throughout the evening. The Queen, initially uncertain about her role as Mrs., discovered she had a natural talent for playing the observant domestic who notices everything while appearing to do nothing. Her ability to move through the gathering almost invisibly, picking up conversations and clues, impressed everyone with its authenticity. Several guests commented later that watching her work was like observing a master detective in action. Prince Philip's interpretation of Professor began entertainingly enough, with appropriate absent-minded mannerisms and lengthy explanations of fictional inventions. However, his enthusiasm for the character led him to create increasingly elaborate props throughout the evening. By dinner time, he had constructed what he claimed was a revolutionary napkin folding device, out of spare cutlery and table decorations, and was attempting to demonstrate its function to anyone who would listen. The formal dinner proceeded according to the mystery plot, with planned revelations and accusations scheduled between each course. However, reality began to diverge from the script when the Queen Mother's Madame character started making predictions that were so hilariously inaccurate they threatened to derail the entire mystery. Her announcement that she could see great romance blossoming between Lady Beatrice and Captain sent Princess Anne into such a fit of laughter that she momentarily broke character entirely. Situation became more complicated when Prince Edward, playing the nervous Timothy, took his character's fearful personality so seriously that he began genuinely jumping at shadows and unexpected sounds. His authentic startled reactions to planned mystery elements were so convincing that other guests started responding with real concern rather than theatrical suspicion. By the main course, several people had forgotten he was acting and were trying to calm him down with genuine reassurance. The climax of the evening arrived with the scheduled murder, the fictional death of a character played by one of Princess' longtime friends. According to the script, the victim was supposed to dramatically collapse during the dessert course, after which the detective character would lead everyone through the process of solving the crime. However, the performance was so realistic that the Queen's personal physician, who was attending as a guest, immediately rushed forward to provide medical assistance. The confusion that followed was unprecedented in royal entertaining history. While the doctor attempted to take the victim's pulse, other guests began arguing about whether they should call for an ambulance or continue with the mystery game. Prince Philip, still in character as professor, began offering to help with one of his invented medical devices, while the Queen Mother insisted that Madame had predicted this exact scenario in her crystal ball. Princess, watching her carefully planned evening dissolve into chaos, made a command decision that demonstrated both her quick thinking and her understanding of family dynamics. Rather than trying to restore order and continue with the scripted mystery, she announced that everyone should solve the crime by creating their own version of events. This improvised approach turned out to be far more entertaining than the original plan. The accusations that followed were both hilarious and revealing. Prince Charles, as Lord Reginald, accused Princess Anne's Lady Beatrice of committing the murder out of jealousy over his fictional horse racing success. Princess Anne responded by suggesting that Lord Reginald had clearly poisoned the victim with his own stupidity, which had somehow become airborne and toxic to anyone within listening distance. Prince Captain presented an elaborate theory involving enemy spies and international intrigue, complete with dramatic reenactments of fictional chase scenes through the castle corridors. Prince Edward's Timothy was too nervous to make any accusations, but suggested that perhaps the death was actually an accident caused by someone being startled by a loud noise. The Queen's Misses offered the evening's most sophisticated solution, presenting a detailed analysis of everyone's movements throughout the evening and explaining how the murder could have been committed by any of them using household items as weapons. Her systematic approach to the problem impressed everyone and demonstrated her natural detective abilities. Prince Philip's professor announced that he had invented a machine that could detect guilt by measuring the electromagnetic fields around suspected criminals. His subsequent testing of each guest with an elaborate contraption made from dinner utensils and flower arrangements provided the evening's most absurd moments, especially when he declared that his readings indicated everyone was equally guilty of something, though not necessarily murder. The Queen Mother's Madame concluded the evening by dramatically revealing that her crystal ball had shown her the truth all along. The victim had actually been killed by supernatural forces jealous of such a wonderful party. This explanation satisfied no one but entertained everyone, and seemed an appropriately theatrical ending to an evening that had veered so far from its original script. As the evening wound down, Princess surveyed the aftermath of her unconventional celebration with obvious satisfaction. The dining room was scattered with Prince Philip's impromptu inventions. Several guests were still arguing about their theories of the crime, and the Queen Mother was continuing to dispense mystical predictions in her invented accent. It was, by any conventional measure, a complete disaster that bore no resemblance to traditional royal entertaining. Yet everyone agreed it had been absolutely wonderful. The family had spent an entire evening laughing together, playing and performing without the constraints of formal protocol or public scrutiny. They had seen each other in completely different roles, discovering hidden talents and unexpected sides of familiar personalities. Prince Charles's comedic timing, Princess Anne's theatrical flair, the Queen's detective instincts, and Prince Philip's inventive enthusiasm had all emerged in ways that formal occasions never allowed. The success of Princess' Murder Mystery birthday party established a new tradition of unconventional celebrations within the royal family. Future milestone events would feature everything from treasure hunts through the palace to elaborate costume competitions, always with the understanding that the goal was genuine enjoyment rather than perfect protocol. The evening also created a treasure trove of family memories that would be shared and embellished for years to come. Prince Philip's electromagnetic guilt detector became a legendary story told at family gatherings, while the Queen Mother's fortune-telling persona would be fondly remembered long after her death. Princess Anne's devastating portrayal of Lady Beatrice inspired family members to regularly quote her most cutting lines, delivered with perfect timing and theatrical flourish. Most importantly, Princess' 70th birthday celebration proved that even the most traditional institutions could benefit from occasional departures from established patterns. The royal family's willingness to embrace absurdity and play together demonstrated a human warmth that formal occasions could rarely reveal, creating bonds and memories that would last far longer than any conventional dinner party. The Swedish royal palace in Stockholm had hosted countless state visits throughout its magnificent history, but none had prepared the household staff for the arrival of King Carlos of Spain in 1985, particularly when it became apparent that His Majesty had developed an unexpected passion for Swedish meatballs that would transform a formal diplomatic occasion into one of the most memorable culinary adventures in European royal history. The visit began normally enough, with the traditional ceremony and pageantry expected for such occasions. King Carl XVI and Queen of Sweden had planned an elegant series of events designed to strengthen the bonds between their two nations while showcasing Sweden's cultural heritage and natural beauty. The Spanish delegation arrived with similar expectations of formal dinners, cultural presentations, and diplomatic discussions conducted with the appropriate level of royal dignity. What nobody anticipated was King Carlos's immediate and overwhelming enthusiasm for Swedish cuisine, specifically for the humble meatball that Sweden had elevated to an art form. The Spanish monarch's first encounter with authentic Swedish meatballs occurred during the welcome luncheon, where they were served as part of a traditional designed to introduce the visiting delegation to local specialties. Most diplomatic guests would have politely sampled the various offerings, perhaps complimenting their hosts on the excellent preparation before moving on to more serious diplomatic discussions. King Carlos, however, took one bite of the perfectly seasoned, expertly prepared meatballs and experienced what could only be described as a culinary revelation. His face lit up with genuine delight, and he immediately turned to King Carl with an enthusiasm that caught everyone by surprise. "These are extraordinary," he announced, temporarily abandoning the usual diplomatic restraint expected at formal occasions. "How are they prepared? What makes them so different from anything I've ever tasted?" The Spanish king's obvious pleasure with the dish delighted his Swedish hosts, who began explaining the traditional preparation methods with growing enthusiasm. The conversation that followed revealed King Carlos's genuine passion for cooking, a hobby that he had been forced to pursue privately due to the formal constraints of royal life. As the luncheon progressed, the two monarchs found themselves engaged in an increasingly technical discussion about seasoning techniques, cooking temperatures, and the optimal meat-to-breadcrumb ratio for achieving perfect meatball texture. Queen, watching her husband become animated in a way she rarely saw during formal diplomatic occasions, encouraged the culinary conversation by sharing family recipes and cooking traditions that had been passed down through generations of Swedish families. Soon, the entire Spanish delegation was learning about the cultural significance of meatballs in Swedish society, from their role in holiday celebrations to their importance in everyday family meals. The situation escalated when King Carlos expressed a desire to learn how to prepare the meatballs himself. This request presented the Swedish protocol staff with an unprecedented challenge. How does one arrange for a visiting head of state to receive cooking lessons during a formal diplomatic visit? The standard schedule of cultural presentations and political discussions hardly allowed time for culinary education. Yet the Spanish king's enthusiasm was so genuine and infectious that everyone wanted to accommodate his unusual request. King Carl, demonstrating the diplomatic flexibility that had served him well throughout his reign, made an executive decision that would transform the remainder of the visit. "Why don't we arrange a cooking demonstration?" he suggested. "Our palace chef would be honored to share his techniques with a fellow enthusiast." This proposal immediately captured the imagination of both royal households, and plans began developing for what would become the most unusual state visit activity in modern European history. The palace kitchen, normally off-limits to anyone except authorized staff, was hastily transformed into a royal cooking classroom. The head chef, a man who had served the Swedish royal family for over 20 years, found himself in the surreal position of preparing to teach meatball preparation techniques to the King of Spain, while maintaining the appropriate level of respect and formality required for such an unprecedented situation. Word of the cooking lesson spread throughout both delegations, creating an atmosphere of anticipation and amusement that was unusual for typically formal diplomatic occasions. Members of the Spanish delegation began expressing their own interest in Swedish cuisine, while Swedish officials started sharing their favorite family recipes and cooking stories. The cultural exchange that was supposed to occur through formal presentations and official ceremonies was happening naturally through shared enthusiasm for food and cooking. The cooking lesson itself exceeded everyone's expectations for entertainment and educational value. King Carlos approached the task with the same intensity and attention to detail that he brought to matters of state, asking detailed questions about every aspect of the preparation process. He wanted to understand not just the mechanics of combining ingredients, but the theory behind each step and the cultural traditions that had shaped the recipe over generations. The sight of the Spanish monarch, dressed in a borrowed apron emblazoned with the Swedish royal arms, carefully measuring spices and mixing ingredients under the watchful eye of the palace chef, created a scene that none of the observers would ever forget. His concentration was complete, his enthusiasm infectious, and his determination to master the technique absolute. Every few minutes, he would pause to ask questions or seek clarification about some aspect of the process. King Carl, initially planning to simply observe the lesson, found himself drawn into the cooking process as well. Soon both monarchs were working side by side, comparing techniques and sharing cooking stories from their respective backgrounds. The Spanish king regaled his Swedish counterpart with tales of his secret culinary experiments in the palace kitchens of Madrid, while King Carl shared memories of helping his grandmother prepare traditional Swedish dishes during childhood visits to her country home. The lesson expanded beyond simple meatball preparation to encompass the entire traditional Swedish meal experience. The chef demonstrated the preparation of cream sauce, lingonberry preserves, and pickled cucumber accompaniments, explaining how each element contributed to the complete flavor profile of the dish. King Carlos absorbed every detail with the enthusiasm of a dedicated student, taking mental notes that he would later use to recreate the experience in his own palace kitchens. The most entertaining moment came when both kings attempted to achieve the perfect spherical shape for their meatballs. What should have been a simple process became an exercise in royal competitiveness, with each monarch determined to create the most perfectly round and uniform meatballs possible. The kitchen staff watched in amazement as two heads of state engaged in friendly rivalry over the aesthetic qualities of their handiwork. Queen, arriving to check on the progress of the lesson, discovered both kings covered in flour and completely absorbed in their culinary competition. Rather than being scandalized by the undignified scene, she began offering helpful suggestions and encouragement, transforming the cooking lesson into an impromptu royal family activity that included both households. The Spanish Queen Sofia, upon being informed about her husband's cooking adventure, hurried to the kitchens to witness the scene firsthand. Her arrival coincided with the critical moment when the meatballs were ready for cooking, and she found herself appointed as an official taste tester for the competing royal creations. The pressure of having two queens evaluate their cooking efforts added an extra dimension of intensity to what was already an unusual situation. The cooking process itself became in royal teamwork and communication. Both kings had to coordinate their use of limited stove space, share cooking utensils, and time their various components to finish simultaneously. The collaboration required the same diplomatic skills they used in international negotiations, but applied to the considerably lower stakes of achieving properly browned meatballs and correctly seasoned cream sauce. The tasting ceremony that concluded the cooking lesson was conducted with appropriate royal solemnity, despite the informal setting and flour-dusted participants. Both queens approached their evaluation duties with the seriousness of judges in an international cooking competition, carefully sampling each element of the meal and offering detailed critiques of flavor, texture, and presentation. King Carlos's meatballs were declared excellent for a first attempt, with particular praise for his attention to seasoning and his achievement of consistent size and shape. King Carl's version received recognition for superior browning technique and perfectly balanced cream sauce. Both monarchs accepted their reviews with good humor and immediately began planning improvements for their next cooking session. The success of the meatball cooking lesson inspired additional culinary activities throughout the remainder of the visit. The formal state dinner that evening featured an extended presentation of Swedish specialties, with both kings providing commentary about preparation techniques they had learned during their kitchen adventure. The Spanish delegation requested recipes to take home, while Swedish officials began planning a return visit that would include exploration of Spanish cuisine. King Carlos's enthusiasm for Swedish meatballs became a running theme throughout the rest of his stay. He requested them at every meal, compared different preparation styles offered by various restaurants during official outings, and engaged Swedish citizens in conversations about their family cooking traditions whenever the opportunity arose. His genuine appreciation for this aspect of Swedish culture created an immediate connection with ordinary people that formal diplomatic protocols rarely achieved. The cultural impact of the visit extended far beyond the immediate diplomatic benefits. News of the Spanish king's cooking lessons spread throughout both countries, creating widespread public interest in cultural exchange through food traditions. Swedish meatball recipes began appearing in Spanish newspapers, while Spanish cuisine gained new popularity in Sweden as people sought to reciprocate the cultural sharing that had occurred during the royal visit. The palace kitchen staff, initially nervous about teaching cooking techniques to foreign royalty, found the experience so rewarding that they began developing additional culinary programs for future state visits. The head chef later commented that watching two kings discover genuine joy in simple food preparation reminded him of why he had chosen cooking as his profession, and reinforced his appreciation for the universal language of good food. King Carlos continued his meatball enthusiasm long after returning to Spain, reportedly attempting to recreate the Swedish palace recipe in his own kitchens with varying degrees of success. Palace staff in Madrid became accustomed to unusual requests for Nordic cooking ingredients and equipment as their monarch pursued his newfound culinary passion with characteristic determination. The diplomatic benefits of the unconventional cooking lesson proved more significant than anyone had anticipated. The personal bond formed between the two kings through their shared culinary adventure created a foundation for enhanced cooperation between their countries that lasted for years afterward. Future discussions between Spain and Sweden were conducted with an warmth and understanding that diplomatic observers attributed directly to the meatball connection established during that memorable visit. Years later, when diplomatic historians looked back on the significant state visits of the 1980s, King Carlos's meatball cooking lesson would be remembered not just as an amusing anecdote, but as an example of how genuine human connections could transform formal diplomatic occasions into meaningful cultural exchanges that benefited both nations involved. The majestic gardens of Versailles had witnessed many spectacular events throughout French history, but perhaps none quite as unexpectedly entertaining as the Great Garden Party disaster of 1987, when what was intended to be an elegant outdoor celebration for visiting European nobility instead became a comedy of natural forces, human error, and royal resilience that would be remembered with both horror and hilarity for decades to come. The occasion was the annual European Royal Garden Party, a tradition that rotated between different European palaces each year, and served as both a diplomatic gathering and a celebration of the continuing bonds between European royal families. France had volunteered to host the event at Versailles, with President eager to showcase the restored grandeur of the palace gardens and demonstrate France's commitment to preserving its royal heritage despite its republican government. The planning had been meticulous, involving months of coordination between the French government, various royal households, and an army of specialists in everything from horticulture to protocol. The famous gardens of Versailles were to provide the perfect backdrop for an afternoon of refined conversation, cultural exchange, and the kind of diplomatic socializing that had been conducted in these same gardens for centuries. Queen Elizabeth II would attend along with Prince Philip, representing Britain's commitment to European cooperation. King Carl XVI and Queen of Sweden planned to bring their young children for their first major international royal gathering. The Dutch royal family, the Belgian monarchy, and representatives from several German noble houses had all confirmed their attendance. Even the Spanish royal family, still glowing from King Carlos's recent Swedish meatball adventure, looked forward to another opportunity for cultural exchange. The weather forecast for the day had been thoroughly analyzed by meteorologists, who predicted ideal conditions: clear skies, gentle breezes, and temperatures perfect for outdoor entertaining. The elaborate marquees erected throughout the gardens were intended primarily for shade and aesthetic appeal rather than protection from the elements. Every detail had been planned to create an atmosphere of effortless elegance that would honor both the historic setting and the distinguished guests. The morning of the party began exactly as planned, with perfect sunshine illuminating the geometric precision of the French gardens and creating the ideal lighting for the numerous photographers who would document this gathering of European royalty. The early arrivals were greeted with champagne and petits fours as they strolled through the carefully manicured pathways, admiring the restoration work that had returned the gardens to their original splendor. Queen Elizabeth II, accompanied by Prince Philip, arrived punctually and immediately began the kind of gracious circulation that had made her famous as a hostess and diplomatic presence. Her conversations with various European royals created the warm, familial atmosphere that these gatherings were designed to foster, reminding everyone present that despite the formal titles and ceremonies, they were essentially an extended family gathering in one of the world's most beautiful settings. The trouble began subtly, with a barely perceptible shift in the wind that caused the elaborate floral arrangements to sway slightly in their positions. The French groundskeepers, veterans of countless outdoor events, noticed the change but initially saw no cause for concern. The weather stations continued to report stable conditions, and the gentle air movement seemed likely to provide welcome relief from what was becoming an increasingly warm afternoon. King Carl XVI of Sweden, enjoying a conversation with the Belgian royals about renewable energy initiatives, was among the first to notice that the wind was carrying an unusual amount of pollen from the surrounding trees. As someone who suffered from seasonal allergies, he recognized the signs of an approaching pollen surge, but the magnificent gardens were so beautiful that he dismissed his concerns as mere personal sensitivity to the natural environment. The pollen cloud that descended on the garden party was unlike anything anyone had experienced before. A combination of unusual weather patterns, the simultaneous blooming of multiple tree species, and atmospheric conditions that concentrated airborne particles created what meteorologists would later describe as a perfect storm of natural allergens. Within minutes, the elegant gathering was transformed into a scene of royal distress as distinguished guests began sneezing, rubbing their eyes, and struggling to maintain their composure while battling severe allergic reactions. Queen Elizabeth II, not typically affected by pollen, found herself sneezing so violently that her carefully arranged hat shifted to an alarming angle. Prince Philip, attempting to assist his wife while dealing with his own streaming eyes, accidentally bumped into a nearby table of refreshments, sending champagne glasses cascading onto the perfectly manicured lawn. The sight of British royalty in such undignified distress sent ripples of concern throughout the gathering. The Swedish royal children, overcome by the sudden assault of allergens, began crying simultaneously, creating a sound that cut through the refined conversation like an alarm bell. Queen, torn between comforting her children and maintaining royal dignity, attempted to continue her conversation with French officials while dabbing at tears that were streaming down her face from the irritation. The Dutch royal family, initially thinking they were experiencing individual health crises, began comparing symptoms and realized that everyone was being affected by the same environmental assault. The normally reserved Dutch protocols dissolved as family members began sharing handkerchiefs and offering each other assistance with the practicality that characterized their approach to royal duties. The German nobles, representing several different houses and regions, responded to the crisis with typical German efficiency, immediately beginning to organize relief efforts and coordinate responses. However, their attempts at systematic problem-solving were hampered by the fact that they could barely see through their pollen-irritated eyes and couldn't stop sneezing long enough to complete sentences. President, horrified that France's attempt to showcase its hospitality was resulting in the mass discomfort of visiting royalty, began frantically consulting with his staff about possible solutions. The French groundskeepers suggested relocating the entire party indoors, but moving several hundred distinguished guests from the gardens into the palace would require a logistical operation that could take hours to organize properly. The situation escalated when the wind patterns shifted again, this time bringing not just pollen, but the aromatic clouds from a nearby parfumerie that was conducting test releases of new fragrances. The combination of natural allergens and artificial scents created an olfactory assault that overwhelmed even those guests who had been managing the pollen reasonably well. King Carlos of Spain, fresh from his Swedish culinary adventures, found that his recently enhanced appreciation for international experiences did not extend to French atmospheric conditions. His attempts to maintain polite conversation while his eyes streamed and his nose ran uncontrollably created a scene that was both touching and hilarious, as he continued to express enthusiasm for French culture between increasingly violent sneezing fits. The royal children, regardless of nationality, abandoned all pretense of formal behavior and began openly crying, sneezing, and complaining about the uncomfortable conditions. Their distress created a chain reaction among their parents, who struggled to provide comfort while dealing with their own symptoms and maintaining the diplomatic courtesy required for international relations. The most memorable moment of the crisis occurred when Queen Elizabeth II, temporarily blinded by streaming tears, accidentally walked directly into one of the ornamental fountains. The sight of the British monarch, soaked to the knees and still sneezing, attempting to maintain her dignity while Prince Philip tried to guide her to safety, created a scene that would be retold in royal circles for generations. Her response to the situation, "Well, at least the water is refreshing," became legendary for its demonstration of grace under ridiculous circumstances. The fountain incident seemed to break the spell of formal restraint that had been preventing everyone from acknowledging the absurdity of the situation. Soon, royals from across Europe were openly laughing at their collective predicament while continuing to sneeze and wipe their eyes. The shared experience of undignified discomfort created a bond between the various families that formal protocols rarely achieved. Prince Philip, never one to let protocol interfere with practical problem-solving, began organizing an informal evacuation toward the palace buildings. His natural leadership abilities, combined with his complete disregard for maintaining appearances while sneezing uncontrollably, inspired others to abandon their formal positions and work together to find relief from the environmental assault. The mass migration of European royalty toward the palace created an unprecedented scene, dozens of distinguished guests streaming across the gardens in various states of allergic distress, supporting each other and sharing remedies while maintaining the kind of good humor that only shared adversity can inspire. The sight of kings and queens helping each other navigate while barely able to see became an impromptu demonstration of international cooperation. Inside the palace, the French staff performed miracles of hospitality, quickly converting formal reception rooms into comfortable refuges where guests could recover from their ordeal. Medical personnel, summoned to address what was initially feared to be a more serious health crisis, found themselves distributing antihistamines and eye drops to some of the most important people in Europe. The afternoon that followed became one of the most relaxed and genuinely enjoyable royal gatherings anyone could remember. Freed from the constraints of formal outdoor protocols, and united by their shared experience of natural disaster, the various royal families began talking with unprecedented openness about their experiences, challenges, and hopes for European cooperation. Queen Elizabeth II, having changed into dry clothing and recovered her composure, proved once again why she was considered one of the world's greatest diplomats. Her ability to find humor in her fountain adventure and use it as a conversation starter helped everyone else relax about their own undignified moments during the pollen crisis. The children, no longer suffering from allergic reactions, began playing together in ways that formal garden party protocol would never have allowed. The sight of young royals from different countries engaged in ordinary childhood games created exactly the kind of warm, familial atmosphere that the original event had hoped to achieve. King Carl XVI, as someone who actually suffered from regular pollen allergies, became an unexpected expert consultant, sharing strategies for managing symptoms and recommending various remedies based on his years of experience. His practical advice helped several other guests and established him as the hero of the afternoon's recovery efforts. The French hosts, initially by the environmental disaster that had disrupted their carefully planned event, gradually came to appreciate how the crisis had actually enhanced the gathering's diplomatic value. The bonds formed through shared adversity and mutual assistance proved stronger than anything that formal protocols could have achieved. As the afternoon progressed and the outdoor air cleared, some brave souls ventured back into the gardens to assess the damage and enjoy the restored beauty of Versailles. The sight of the magnificent gardens, now peaceful and allergen-free in the late afternoon light, provided a perfect ending to a day that had tested everyone's adaptability and sense of humor. The Great Garden Party disaster of 1987 became a defining moment in European royal relations, referenced in future gatherings as an example of how shared challenges could strengthen international bonds. The various royal families maintained friendships that had been deepened by their collective experience of undignified sneezing and mutual assistance. Years later, when European royals gathered for other occasions, someone would invariably reference the Versailles pollen incident, triggering fond memories of the day when natural forces had humbled kings and queens, while simultaneously bringing them closer together than any formal diplomatic protocol ever could. The ancient halls of Edinburgh Castle had echoed with the sounds of celebration for centuries, but none had quite prepared the Scottish heritage for Prince William's infamous 21st birthday celebration in 2003, when what began as a traditional Highland gathering somehow evolved into the most elaborate practical joke war in British royal history, involving kilts, haggis, and a series of increasingly absurd pranks that would test the diplomatic skills of everyone involved. The planning for Prince William's coming-of-age celebration had been deliberately designed to honor both his English royal heritage and his deep connection to Scotland, where he had spent formative years at university and developed genuine friendships outside the constraints of royal protocol. The Queen, recognizing the importance of this milestone birthday, had approved a celebration that would be more personal and relaxed than typical royal occasions, allowing William's university friends to participate alongside family members. The decision to hold the celebration at Edinburgh Castle reflected Prince William's love for Scotland and his desire to include his university friends in what would be one of the most significant celebrations of his young life. These friends, brilliant students who had learned to see William as simply another university colleague rather than a future king, brought an energy and irreverence to royal occasions that often surprised and delighted the more traditional members of the royal household. The trouble began during the preliminary planning meetings when Prince Harry, then 19 and already notorious for his mischievous sense of humor, suggested that the celebration should include proper Highland traditions that would give the English relatives and foreign dignitaries an authentic Scottish experience. His innocent-sounding proposal contained the seeds of what would become an escalating series of practical jokes that tested everyone's ability to maintain dignity while participating in increasingly ridiculous Highland customs. Prince William, initially focused on ensuring that his university friends felt comfortable among the royal family and international guests, failed to recognize the gleam in his younger brother's eyes that typically preceded Harry's most elaborate pranks. The heir to the throne was more concerned with diplomatic courtesy than with defending himself against sibling mischief, an oversight that would prove costly as the evening progressed. The celebration began traditionally enough, with the formal receiving line where Prince William greeted distinguished guests with appropriate ceremony and grace. King Carl XVI and Queen of Sweden had traveled to Scotland specifically for the occasion, still sharing fond memories of their previous culinary adventures and eager to experience authentic Scottish culture. The Spanish royal family attended despite ongoing concerns about King Carlos's tendency to become enthusiastically involved in local customs, while various British nobles and European dignitaries completed the guest list. The first indication that the evening might deviate from typical royal protocols came when Prince Harry appeared in what he claimed was traditional Highland dress, wearing a kilt that seemed unusually elaborate even by Scottish standards. The garment featured an excessive number of decorative elements, including what appeared to be small bells attached to various portions of the outfit that created a gentle jingling sound whenever he moved. Prince William, greeting guests while wearing his own more conventional Highland formal wear, initially dismissed his brother's elaborate costume as typical Harry flamboyance. However, the younger prince's insistence that all male guests should honor Scottish tradition by wearing kilts during the celebration created the first challenge to the evening's dignity, particularly when it became apparent that many of the international visitors had never worn such garments before. The sight of King Carl XVI attempting to navigate the complexities of proper Highland dress, while maintaining royal dignity, provided the first entertainment of the evening. The Swedish monarch, game for any cultural experience after his meatball adventures, approached the challenge with characteristic good humor but obvious uncertainty about the mechanics of wearing an unfamiliar garment with appropriate decorum. Prince Harry, positioning himself as an expert on Highland traditions despite his relatively recent acquaintance with Scottish customs, began offering helpful advice about proper kilt-wearing etiquette that seemed unusually detailed and suspiciously specific. His explanations of traditional Highland walking techniques, ceremonial sitting positions, and proper methods for climbing stairs while wearing a kilt created an elaborate set of rules that had never appeared in any authentic Scottish etiquette guide. The Spanish delegation, led by King Carlos, who was eager to embrace yet another international cultural experience, threw themselves into Highland dress with enthusiasm that exceeded their understanding of the relevant traditions. The sight of Spanish royalty attempting to follow Prince Harry's increasingly creative interpretations of Scottish customs created a scene that was both touching and hilarious as they struggled to honor their hosts while maintaining personal dignity. The formal dinner proceeded with appropriate Highland ceremony, including the traditional piping in of the haggis accompanied by readings from Robert Burns and toasts to Scottish heritage. Prince William, in his role as guest of honor, delivered a thoughtful speech about his love for Scotland and appreciation for the friends and family who had gathered to celebrate with him. The ceremony demonstrated the genuine cultural richness that had inspired the evening's Highland theme. However, Prince Harry's interpretation of Highland dining customs began to deviate significantly from authentic tradition when he announced that proper Scottish etiquette required guests to stand and recite original poetry in honor of the birthday prince. This unexpected requirement created panic among international visitors who had prepared for many diplomatic challenges, but had not anticipated the need for spontaneous creative verse composition. King Carl XVI, drawing on his experience with improvised royal entertainment from previous gatherings, rose to the challenge by delivering a heartfelt poem about friendship between Sweden and Scotland that rhymed Highland heather with stormy weather and royal brother. His sincere effort to honor both the occasion and his hosts demonstrated the kind of diplomatic grace that made him beloved among European royalty. The poetry requirement inspired increasingly creative responses as guests realized that elaborate literary pretensions were less important than genuine participation in the celebration. Queen contributed a charming verse about Scottish hospitality, while various British nobles offered humorous tributes to Prince William's university achievements and future royal responsibilities. Prince Harry, encouraged by the success of his poetry innovation, announced that authentic Highland celebration also required guests to demonstrate traditional Scottish dancing skills. This declaration created immediate concern among international visitors who had mastered many diplomatic arts, but had never learned Highland reels or country dancing. The prospect of European royalty attempting complex Scottish folk dances while wearing unfamiliar Highland dress promised entertainment that exceeded anyone's expectations. Prince William, finally beginning to recognize his brother's mischievous agenda, attempted to moderate the dancing requirement by suggesting that participation should be voluntary rather than mandatory. However, the international guests, caught up in the spirit of cultural exchange and determined to honor their hosts properly, insisted on attempting the traditional dances despite their obvious lack of preparation for such activities. The dancing that followed created scenes that would be remembered and recounted at royal gatherings for years to come. The sight of dignified European monarchs attempting Highland reels while learning the steps from Prince Harry's increasingly creative choreographic instructions provided entertainment that transcended simple humor and became a celebration of good-natured international cooperation. King Carlos, still enthusiastic about cultural immersion after his Swedish cooking adventures, threw himself into Scottish dancing with characteristic intensity, creating elaborate interpretations of traditional steps that bore only passing resemblance to authentic Highland choreography, but demonstrated tremendous enthusiasm for cross-cultural participation. The evening's climax came when Prince Harry announced that the final Highland tradition required the birthday celebration to conclude with a traditional Scottish treasure hunt through Edinburgh Castle, with guests working in international teams to locate hidden objects throughout the historic fortress. This activity, promised to combine cultural education with competitive entertainment, while testing everyone's ability to maintain dignity during an elaborate nighttime adventure. The treasure hunt teams were deliberately composed to maximize international cooperation and cultural exchange, pairing British royals with visiting dignitaries in combinations that encouraged both friendship and friendly competition. Prince William found himself partnered with King Carl XVI, creating a team that combined future British leadership with Swedish diplomatic experience and mutual appreciation for absurd situations. Queen Elizabeth II, initially planning to observe the treasure hunt from a position of appropriate royal dignity, became increasingly involved in the competition when it became apparent that the clues required detailed knowledge of Scottish history and Edinburgh Castle's architectural features. Her expertise in both subjects made her an invaluable team member, transforming the Queen into an active participant in her grandson's birthday adventure. Prince Philip, never one to resist a good competition, emerged as one of the treasure hunt's most enthusiastic participants, applying the same intensity to solving historical riddles that he brought to all his activities. His partnership with Spanish royalty created a formidable team that combined British historical knowledge with Spanish determination to excel at international cultural exchange. The treasure hunt clues, presumably created by Prince Harry with assistance from university friends familiar with both Scottish history and elaborate pranks, led teams through increasingly amusing challenges that tested everything from historical knowledge to physical agility to diplomatic problem-solving skills. The sight of European royalty crawling through castle corridors in Highland dress while searching for hidden objects created memories that would last far beyond the immediate celebration. The winning team, composed of Prince William, King Carl XVI, and Queen, discovered the final treasure in a location that required them to climb a narrow castle tower staircase while maintaining appropriate Highland dress dignity. Their victory was celebrated with appropriate ceremony, including a prize presentation that featured additional Highland accessories that had been specially crafted for the occasion. As the evening concluded, participants gradually realized that they had been unwitting participants in Prince Harry's elaborate practical joke, designed to test the limits of royal dignity and international diplomatic courtesy. However, the shared experience of competitive treasure hunting while wearing Highland dress had created genuine bonds between the various royal families that exceeded the diplomatic benefits of traditional formal entertaining. Prince William, recognizing that his brother's pranks had actually enhanced rather than disrupted his birthday celebration, delivered a concluding speech that thanked everyone for their good humor and willingness to embrace Scottish traditions, regardless of their authenticity. His gracious acknowledgement of the evening's absurdity while expressing genuine appreciation for everyone's participation demonstrated the diplomatic skills that would serve him well in future royal responsibilities. The 21st birthday celebration became a defining moment in modern royal entertaining, proving that formal occasions could benefit from elements of surprise, humor, and interactive participation. The willingness of distinguished international guests to embrace potentially undignified activities in the spirit of cultural exchange strengthened relationships between European royal families in ways that traditional diplomatic protocols rarely achieved. Years later, when European royals gathered for other occasions, references to Highland traditions would immediately trigger fond memories of the evening when Prince Harry's elaborate practical jokes had created one of the most memorable royal celebrations in modern history. The shared experience of treasure hunting through Edinburgh Castle while wearing kilts became a bond that connected participants long after the immediate entertainment had ended. The success of Prince William's unconventional birthday celebration established a new tradition of incorporating interactive elements and cultural education into royal gatherings, always with the understanding that the goal was genuine enjoyment and international friendship rather than rigid adherence to traditional protocols. The evening proved that even the most formal institutions could benefit from occasional departures from established patterns when the spirit of the occasion supported genuine human connection and cross-cultural understanding.